It is a great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speakers tonight, Chuck Close and Christopher Finch, who will be in conversation. Chuck Close is one of today's best-known and most highly regarded artists. He began his career in the mid-1960s and really as a maverick, bucking the dominance of abstract art to make supersized images of the human face. At a time of cool, minimalist, and conceptual art, his commitment to portraiture seemed a stunning rebuke. But it soon became apparent that his likenesses were built on a rigorous conceptual scaffolding, and that the mechanics of representation were as interesting to him as the representations themselves. Close has maintained that fine balance between means and ends for over 45 years now. At the same time, he has continually moved forward, innovating at every turn, trying new media, and pushing the bounds of what's possible. His art is deeply intelligent and truly magical. Everyone knows that to be true who has seen the exhibition upstairs or who is already familiar with his work. What you may not know is that Chuck is a highly public figure. He serves on the Presidential Committee on the Arts and Humanities. He authored a book of interviews with other artists. He painted the portrait of President Clinton, now on view at the National Portrait Gallery. He received the National Medal of the Arts, and for those fans of late-night TV, he was recently on the Colbert Report. Christopher Finch has been Chuck Close's friend for more than 40 years. Trained as a painter in London, he began his writing career as an art critic. He soon began writing for exhibition catalogs and books, focusing on pop art in Europe and America. In 1968, Finch became an associate curator at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. From there, he moved to New York and returned to freelancing, contributing articles to Arts, Art News, Art in America, and other periodicals. He has also authored best-selling books on popular culture, including Walt Disney, Judy Garland, Norman Rockwell, and Jim Henson. Finch's beautiful and lavishly illustrated monograph, which I know many of you were fortunate enough to purchase tonight and have signed by both of them, which is called Chuck Close Work, was recently republished by Prestel in a revised and expanded edition. In addition, his companion biography, Chuck Close Life, which I know many of you also purchased, was also recently published by Prestel. There's no question that he is the right person to conduct an interview with Chuck Close. Please join me in welcoming Chuck Close and Christopher Finch.
Good audience.
Yeah.
Actually, I feel one thing of signing the books first is I feel we know you at this point. No, it's Chuck more than 40 years ago when I was a curator at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. I think it was actually probably 42 years ago, almost to the week.
Really?
I got a call from a friend, Bob Israel. I was in my apartment in Minneapolis, and he said, I just saw a painting this afternoon that you absolutely have to see. And he began to describe the painting, and then he said, no. He said, you just have to come to New York and see it for yourself, which a couple of weeks later I did. Chuck was then living in a loft on Green Street, which he has summed up as rats and rags, rags and rats. It was not the most salubrious place in the world, but it had a loading dock that didn't even have steps. You had to climb up onto it. I rang the bell, and this very tall young man in, I remember very clearly, a denim shirt over a white T-shirt, answered the door. He was very friendly.
That was before Soho Black.
What?
It was before Soho Black.
This was before All Black, yeah. This was when artists had to look as though they were workers. And Chuck took me upstairs to the loft, which was studio and living space combined. And actually, there were two astonishing paintings there. One was a 21-foot-long nude, black and white nude, that was a pretty amazing painting. And then on the adjacent wall, there was this 9-foot-tall self-portrait of a very moody young man. I will see it in a minute. With a cigarette dangling from his mouth. He's always explained that by saying it was his James Dean phase. And this, I knew the moment I saw it, this was an astonishing painting, and that I wanted the Walker to buy this painting, which eventually they did for the glorious price of $1,300, which they paid in 2 annual payments, $650 each. But
I don't know math, but I do know it's $650 a year. So
yeah. Chuck started talking about his work, and what I was thinking of when I was walking around the show upstairs is one of the first things he said to me is, I am painting for museums. I want my work to be in museums. I don't want anything to do with private collectors. And here we are, a wonderful museum.
Except for Francis.
Great private collectors. For me, that was the beginning. We've been friends for 42 years, and I've written these 2 books, the second of which was a biography, and having written the monograph, I thought this is going to be pretty easy. But what you learn is that even when you've known somebody for 42 years, you don't really know them at all until you start trying to write a biography. So
I didn't know until I read it.
No, well, that's just true. He said the reason he asked me, it was only going to be 1 book originally, but he said he wanted to hear the story in somebody else's words for a change, because I think he'd gotten a little too polished in his routines, perhaps. I mean, he was a great one-man show, but 2-man show we're fine. So let's go back to the beginning, and this will be the very beginning.
Well, let me just say, Francis, are you here? Okay. I didn't want to meet any of my collectors because I was afraid they might be jerks. and I didn't want to. I was afraid they were going to be jerks, and I didn't want jerks to own my work, and I always insisted that my dealers, first Klaus Curtis at Bikert and then Arnie Glimsher at Pace, that they show the work in the warehouse or somewhere else. And one of the great thrills of my life was to find out just how wrong I was, not only with Sydney and Francis, who were truly wonderful, generous, amazingly philanthropic people. And I don't know what this museum would be like. It would be empty, it would be hollow without the gifts of the Lewis family, including, besides contemporary art, the absolutely amazing Art Nouveau and Art Deco furniture collection that they gave. So not only did they turn out not to be jerks, they turned out to be part of a really large group of really amazing people who have given works to museums. Museums, by and large, if you don't already know this, can't afford to buy art. And it's really the generosity of people like the Lewises who lay out for us this smorgasbord of images to enjoy whenever we go into a museum. So I'd like to, I'll drink, I'm drinking, you're not, but I'll drink to Francis.
I would love to second that, of course, but we'll turn to Chuck and Chuck's life and this. Believe it, isn't this perfect for a great American artist, this is the house that Chuck Close was born in. I mean, this looks like a Christianberry photograph or something. It's just, or a painting by some regionalist in the 1930s. And this is how it looks today,
I was
isn't it?
born at home, right in there.
Do you know which room?
I know the piano was in the room where the windows blocked out, so it must have been the other side.
That's it. Chuck, it's interesting you mentioned the piano, though, because you very much grew up, even though you grew up, you've sometimes said that certain members of your family, anyway, not your immediate family, you were the redneck Chucks, the Closes. But your mother was a pianist, I mean, who, had it not been for the Depression, might well have had a career as
For the Depression, and a very neurotic mother who wouldn't let her travel.
and a very neurotic mother, right? But you grew up in a house where the main living room was usually pretty much filled up with a grand piano, with everything else lightly arranged around it.
And my father was an inventor. He worked for the Army Air Corps as a sheet metal man and ran a sheet metal shop, and had been a plumber and a electrician and stuff, and actually
Also a water diviner.
yes, and he decorated windows in department stores.
Yeah. With great distinction, I believe. I mean, he really made a career out of it, which I would assume that during the Depression it must have been very difficult to make a career as doing shop windows.
Yeah, especially for hardware stores.
You have to sell stuff, right?
No, he really decorated the hardware stores.
Yeah.
They put a bow on a screwdriver. I don't know what they...
Well, but he apparently, from as I recall from your Aunt Bina's, one of the things that was a wonderful advantage for me in writing the biography was Chuck had a family history from his Aunt Bina.
Who was my great aunt, my grandmother's sister.
And she described how your father actually totally redesigned the windows of that hardware store so that everything could be more effectively displayed.
It was a huge commercial hardware store. You know. But anyhow, it was an interesting family. This was a near Appalachian mill town in the state of Washington, where everybody worked in the same mills that their mothers and fathers worked in. In fact, most of my high school graduating class still live within a block or two of where they grew up. So I don't know how I ever managed to get out. But
you said that you had been recommended perhaps for nursing was one possibility.
well, I
right?
was a very. Should we start here? Let's start with.
We should look at a couple of pictures here. This is Chuck and his mother. Was this a bicycle that was built by your father?
No, that's a tricycle. He built my first bicycle. It was a war, and there weren't any toys, so. I was a young magician, and actually a very large number of artists were interested in magic. And I do believe that painting is the most magical of mediums, and I actually just did a thing for television with the magician David Blaine, and we talk a lot about the similarities as conjuring up images and illusions for people. The only difference was that when I did a magic trick, I wanted to go back. I broke the cardinal rule of magicianship, which is as soon as I did it, I wanted to show you how I did the trick.
But is that still true with your painting today?
I think absolutely true today. Embedded in the work that I do is all the evidence of its own making. And anybody who wants to go back and, I've always said it's like dropping crumbs along the trail, Hansel and Gretel style. Anyone who wants to pick up the crumbs can retrace the journey that I made. It's not necessary to do that, but if you care to, you really do understand how art gets made. And people seem to respond to that. I have a print show which just closed at Corcoran in Washington. So, anybody see it? Which lays out the process and how things happen. But
while we're talking about your childhood, would you care to say something about your childhood dyslexia and
virtually
how this had an impact on?
Virtually, I guess I'm going to have to drink water after all. I hate to drink this stuff. But,
what in the glass?
yeah, no, it's all right. I'm sorry. Virtually everything in my work, I was an indulged child, you can see. Doesn't every kid have a monkey? I did pay for it myself, though.
Picking strawberries, right?
Right. Virtually everything about my work is actually driven by my learning disabilities, but those of you, probably not very many here, were around in the 40s and 50s. You'll know that learning disabilities hadn't been invented yet. There was no such thing as dyslexia, you were just dumb. So I was a terrible student. I also had lifelong neuromuscular issues. I couldn't run, I couldn't throw a ball, I couldn't catch a ball, I couldn't do anything. So, and not being, I never really learned to add and subtract. To this day, I add by using the spots on dominoes. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And I still don't know the multiplication tables. And on top of it all, I have a condition called
prosopagnosia,
which is
I think that's how it's pronounced. I've never heard anybody else pronounce it. So
well,
it's known as face blindness.
Face blindness, yeah. Well, that's the way Oliver Sacks pronounced it.
Well, then I must be right.
And he has it too. But I think really every decision was driven by those disabilities. And one of the interesting things about having a deficit is nature, I think, mitigates for a deficit and probably gives you some other things to make up for it, and maybe some heightened skills or some aptitude in other areas.
And perhaps a sense of drama, because I spoke to a number of Chloe's, that's my daughter, where did that name come from? Chuck's former classmates.
Well, because she has learning disabilities too. Because she has learning
She's
disabilities.
dyslexia too, yeah. But you made a tremendous impression on these people in junior high school. I mean, you could show up at school with a monkey on your shoulder and dressed as Tarzan, and people took notice of that fact.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is they don't remember how badly I did in school.
They don't. That's absolutely true. When everyone I asked, they said, "Well, I don't know. We didn't think you did particularly well, but yeah."
But maybe none of us were doing very well.
Well, no, I think they all tend. No, it's very interesting. Chuck has talked about being in this bottom-feeding stream, and all these guys talk about being in this bottom-feeding stream. But the people I'm talking about, they all are still practicing artists who have made a success of their lives to a greater or larger extent.
Very unlikely. I mean, in a high school graduating class of 500, we produced one doctor, but he was a chiropractor. I don't really consider that a doctor. And one lawyer who was indicted 2 years later. So this was not an upwardly mobile bunch of people. And And nobody that I knew aspired to be a doctor or a lawyer or...
But there was one wonderful, this was Everett, we're talking about Everett, Washington, and there was one thing about Everett, Washington that made it, for somebody like yourself, a very fortunate place to be living, with Everett Junior College.
Mm-hmm. I am the product of open enrollment, and I'd like to put in a plug for junior colleges, community colleges, and alternatives, because I never would have gotten into a regular four-year school. Thank God it was before SATs, too, so I would have been in big trouble. But I didn't take algebra, geometry, physics, or chemistry in high school, and so I couldn't get into any school, in any regular college. But I was able to get into this junior college, which had an incredible art program, and then I managed to transfer from there to the University of Washington, where I did very well.
Where he did this painting?
I did this, yeah, just barely after I got into the University of Washington. It's about 1961. I think the thing about learning disabilities is that if you're not destroyed by them, you become rather strong. And art had saved my life all the way through school. When I couldn't remember the names and dates and the facts, and I would do a 20-foot-long mural of Lewis and Clark Trail, and I would drag it into the history class to show my teacher that at least I was interested in the material. And that was very important because if they were human beings, they would recognize the effort that I made, and it would mitigate from my poor performance. So art was in there very early as something that I thought, well, this is something that I can do. And everyone needs to feel special. When I grew up in the 40s and 50s, in this sort of poor white trash mill town, there were no black people, every student had, every day of the week, from kindergarten through high school, both art and music. And for those of us who learn differently or cannot excel in the 3 R's, it's nice to have the fourth R, art. If I hadn't had that, I don't know what I would have become. I always have often said, if I hadn't gone to Yale, I could have gone to jail. And that's not a joke. I mean, it could have gone either way. Some of my friends did go to jail. No one else went to Yale.
There were some of your friends from Yale who might have gone to jail
Right.
too, come to think of it. Here are some of the friends from Yale.
One of whom is in the exhibition downstairs.
But anyway, Chuck went on to University of Washington and on to Yale. Almost by accident, you actually went to Yale.
Yeah,
For the
I owe
graduate
everything
program.
to Fidel Castro. Honestly.
Don't we all?
I graduated from the University of Washington, and I thought I was going to avoid the draft. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs. And all of a sudden, I found that I was draftable after all. And I only went to graduate school to stay out of the Army, and so I owe everything to Fidel.
This is actually, you've already graduated. From,
Yeah, after I graduated from Yale, several of us had Fulbrights. That's Nancy Graves, who was married to Richard Serra with my hat on, and then Stephen Posen, who is a wonderful painter besides being Zach Posen's dad. And we were at Donatello's grave in Florence while I was on a Fulbright.
Now this is one of the 2 paintings that I saw when I first visited Chuck's studio. This is 21-foot long nude, which for a long time has it been exhibited recently at all?
It was exhibited in a retrospective in Germany, but never.
Right, but that's the only time, right? Well, why have you been reluctant to?
Well, you know, it's hard to roll it out and stretch it out.
Yeah, but
people
not
who own it
impossible.
don't want to lend
right,
it. You know,
but I mean, you have always thought of this as an unsatisfactory.
Well, no, I
painting.
don't think so. It was a very important painting to have made, and it was the proving ground. It was the first piece that I made with an airbrush, and after I had thrown away traditional materials. Let me just back up and say that since we were talking about education, I was a very good student. A good art student learns quicker than some of his or her colleagues what art looks like. Once you know what art looks like, it's not hard to make some of it, but it's going to look like someone else's art or it won't look like art. And what that meant was that my hand moved in clichéic ways that made art shapes. I made shapes that looked like de Kooning. Actually, when I met de Kooning late in his life, I said, it's really nice to meet somebody who's made a few more de Koonings than I've made. And I was told I had a good sense of color, which meant that I'd learned that certain color combinations look more like art than other color combinations. And I got scholarships and pats on the head and everything else for knowing that.
Yeah, because you were better than anybody else.
Well, no, I wasn't that much better than anyone else.
Of course you were.
But at any rate, I had a dilemma that all people who get out of graduate school have when they go into the studio for the first time. And they sit in that room and they look around, and it's populated. It's populated by all of their heroes, all the people whose work they respect and all the people whose work that they ripped off. Now it's appropriation. We used to just copy. Everyone was in the room but me. And I didn't know where I was and what my vision and my voice was. So I had to purge the studio of all of my heroes. We don't really react against work because we hate it, which is one of the misgivings, I think, one of the misconceptions, that art moves in reaction against earlier work. Often, in my case, I loved the work of my heroes. I was just doomed to be a follower, doomed to be a second or third generation abstract expressionist, imitating the surface of paintings. I wasn't old enough, hadn't experienced enough to have any angst of my own. I could only imitate someone else's angst. What I did was purge my work by limiting myself so I could no longer make the work that I made in school. I decided to work from photographs so that I wouldn't make shapes that looked like art. It had to be the shape in the photograph. I couldn't depend on color, so I made black and white works so I wouldn't depend on that. I had been tentative, paint it in, paint it out, scrape it off, do something else. So I decided to work with only thinned down black paint so that every mark that went on the canvas would still be there at the end. So I wanted to make a big, aggressive, confrontational image. Ta-da.
How long did this take you to paint?
You don't want to go to the
How long
next
did this
slide?
take you to paint?
The
nude.
3 months, maybe? Something like that.
And this?
Okay. So I wanted to make a big, aggressive, thank you, confrontational image. And the nude was still not big enough. So I was the only person in the room when I was photographing the nude, and I turned the camera on myself, and I made this image. I had seen two.
But were you thinking of going out and photographing, having Richard Serra or Bob Israel or one of the people you did do black and white portraits of? Were you thinking of, at that point, of having them come in?
No, not at all. Not at all. The nude was just not big enough.
Yeah.
And it had hot spots.
Yeah.
I wanted to make every piece of the painting of equal importance, but people would gravitate towards certain areas. And so I decided I would just use part of the figure, and literally that day, you can see it was a hot day, didn't have a shirt on, and I'd been painting nudes, and I guess I thought I
Well,
might...
wait a minute. You said that you told me that you don't have a shirt on because you
I
thought
was
of it as
making
an
one
extension
more
of the
nude.
nude. Yeah,
One
right.
more nude.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, I just shot, I wasn't naked down below, but sorry. But I wanted to make a kind of Brobdingnagian world that was almost a landscape that one would traverse, too big to see as a whole. And if you think of Gulliver's little Lilliputians crawling over the face of the giant, knowing everything about that face, stumbling over beard hairs or falling into a nostril, and still not even knowing that they were on the head of a giant. I wanted that kind of knock your socks off confrontational image from a distance. But I also wanted to make it about intimacy and art marks and some other kind of experience up close.
And about photography, right?
Yes. Clearly they're made from photographs.
I mean, from the beginning, the depth of field was very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, at first the depth of field was accidental. I didn't realize I was going to make part of it out of focus.
Yeah.
Then when it happened, I said, oh, that's interesting. And great to do with an airbrush.
Because, I mean, it's the depth of field that emphasizes the fact that you're not making a painting of a person who is sitting for a portrait. You're making a painting of a photograph.
Well, I didn't want to paint people from life because they'd be in my studio for 3 or 4 months. Yeah. And they gain weight, they lose weight, their hair gets long, they cut it off, they're happy, they're sad, they're awake, they're asleep. The painting becomes a mean average.
How does Lucian Freud deal with that?
I don't know. Ask him. Yeah. You're the Brit. Yeah. Go ask him. Let's get this picture off the screen. Don't you think they've seen it?
Yeah, all right. Let's get another one.
That's for scale. Yeah, I wanted to paint anonymous people. Warhol was painting superstars, and I thought, well, I don't want to touch that. And so, although I have to say the difference between Warhol and me, because he was a hero, he definitely was a hero, as was Alex Katz and Philip Pearlstein and some other people who were trying to make intelligent 20th century figuration, not rewarmed 19th century notions of figuration. And, but I also wanted to distance myself from him, and he was making superstars, but he also made them in one squeegee stroke. That's one stroke and the whole thing is there. I was much more interested in building an image very slowly out of small bits and pieces. But anyhow, I wanted anonymous people, so I just asked my friends. So that's the composer Philip Glass and the sculptor Richard Serra, who managed to get famous on me and screw up my...
But who were also working with the same kind of processes that you were.
Absolutely. Philip had purged his music of all the things that people think of when they think of music. He limited himself to 5 or 6 notes. They went in and out of phase. It was very reductive, very minimalist. Richard Serra had given up bronze and wood and stone and welding and
he was actually more of a painter when you were together.
He was a painter,
right?
Yes, he was a painter. Painted just like Hans Hofmann. But anyhow, he haunted the shops on Canal Street, got rubber and lead and all kinds of other non-art materials, and then proceeded to see what they would do. So it was a time, you have to remember, it's 1967, 68. The world had come apart at the seams. You know, we had the civil rights problems, the assassinations. Kennedy came to visit Yale my first year there, and he was assassinated my second year. 1968, you had Malcolm X, you had Martin Luther King, and then the Democratic Convention, and Bobby Kennedy. So every institution was distrusted. Every belief system was thrown out the window.
And I don't think
art
people
reflected
realize
that.
how radical Chuck's work seemed at the time.
Art really reflected that desire to throw away all the conventions and traditions, to throw away the institutions which were no longer trusted, and to try and find another way to make stuff. And that's really, and if you look in the beautiful reinstallation that John Ravenel did of the collection downstairs, or on this whatever floor it's on, most of those people I went to school with or I studied with, we were all in the process.
The connections are very interesting. I mean, I don't think many people realize that Phil Glass in those days was Richard Serra's assistant.
Yes.
And was earning his living as a plumber, basically.
He was a plumber, he was a taxi driver. He was driving the taxi one day, and he'd already done Einstein on the Beach while he was still a taxi driver. And a woman in the back seat of his cab said, "Young man, do you know you have the same name as a very famous composer?"
I never heard.
He didn't even tell her. He didn't want to break the spell. We're going to have to move on, or we're never going to get.
Yeah, but it's nice to be leisurely.
Yeah, it is. So
there's a lovely Joe Zucker, the portrait of Joe Zucker there.
Joe Zucker?
Lovely Joe Zucker upstairs.
There's a Joe Zucker upstairs,
Yeah.
really nice.
Wow.
Joe Zucker is the only person who changed the way he looked before I painted him. That was also Bob Israel, the set designer, and Nancy Graves.
That's Bob Israel who tipped me off to the fact that I should go see Chuck's work. Yeah.
And Nancy, who was married to Richard Serra, that's Phil Glass, of course. The work was applied. I got rid of traditional tools with which I had so many habits. It's very hard to change. And many of the habits you have are so associated with the materials and techniques that you use and the tools you use that it's painful to make a change. So I just decided to just use an airbrush and to put paint on with rags, my fingers, airbrush, and then to erode and scrape away with the razor blades. And
Also using acrylic when you love the oil
that's right.
so much.
Yeah, right. I actually got rid of everything I loved to see if I could still make a painting. But you can see, hopefully, that it's highly eroded and manipulated. At a certain point, I thought, I'm doing all the talking. You tell them what I did. I'm doing all the talking. You tell them what I did and why I did this.
Well, okay, I think if we move on to this one, we get some idea. Chuck, how many black and white paintings were there in that first group?
seven,
Like seven or
eight.
something.
Yeah,
It's a very small number, and he seemed to feel that he'd done what he wanted to, not that what he could do with that, but what he wanted to have done. And he was going to move on, and there was some talk about, I remember going to the studio, and he would say, well, I might do landscape. You were talking about doing water, I remember, at one time.
Yeah, then I realized, you know, I'm glad Cezanne painted apples. I'm glad Morandi painted bottles. I don't want to paint that stuff. You know.
I couldn't have put it that well. And so he wanted to find, he's going to stay with the portrait. I mean, this is an absolutely crucial point with all of Chuck's work, that most artists, when they want to do something new, change the subject matter. Chuck kept the subject matter and changed the way that he made the paintings.
Because that changes what I do in the studio each day. If I change subject matter, I would be doing the same thing, it would just be different imagery. If you change the working method, the process, the technique, the materials, the scale, touch, hand, you're a different artist each time you do it. So this painting is actually, I made paintings without, the black and white paintings were made without the use of a palette. Palette is a device in which you make decisions out of context.
Which is the big difference between Chuck and most photorealist paintings, who still use conventional palettes, mixing the paint before they apply it to the canvas.
Right. So you make a decision out of context and hope when you put it into the rectangle, it's the right one. I'd done away with the palette, so I wanted to make a full color painting in which I did not use a palette, where all the color mixed on the canvas. So can you back up to the previous one? Okay.
Ooh. This is what they tell you. All right.
Which politician
That's
was
embarrassing.
it? It was what's his name, Schifferbrains, who answered the phone during the debate, right? What was his name? We've already forgotten. Glad it was your phone and not mine. But if you could, I don't know if you can see, but it's 3 one-color paintings on top of each other, a red painting, a blue painting, and a yellow painting. So if you look at the eyes, there's just the magenta eyes, add the blue, and it's the purple state, add the yellow, and you have full color. So the paintings are made by superimposing 3 one-color paintings on top of each other. And it didn't occur to me.
The color is mixed in the viewer's eye.
Mixed there, and yeah. And I couldn't figure out why the damn things were taking so long. Then I realized.
This is dyslexia.
Yeah. Each painting took 3 or 4 months. Each black and white painting took 3 or 4 months. A 3-color painting is going to take a year. It was a real shock and an arithmetic lesson.
One of the things that always astonishes me is that if we just go back very briefly to the black and white paintings, these were painted with the amount of acrylic paint, Chuck has said, that fits on your thumbnail, diluted for use with the airbrush. And this was something that his accountant, for example, found very hard to believe. But
after 7 paintings, I'd used one. He says, "Don't you have any paint to deduct?" I used 1 60-cent tube of paint for the entire of acrylic black paint.
So these at least cost 3 times as much.
This is a black and white. It's a color watercolor, 7 feet high, done with red, blue, and yellow of my wife.
The black and white continuous tone portrait upstairs is also watercolor.
That's right.
And why not more watercolors? It's such a logical medium to use for this when you're using transparent color like that.
Well, it was harder than doing it on gesso.
Really?
Yeah, because the pigment becomes more embedded in the thing. Plus, people don't buy works on paper.
Yeah, even when they're mounted on canvas.
Even when they're mounted on
think
canvas,
that's cheating.
That shows what it looks like up close. All right, now I was trying to make a painting that was of equal interest all over, but obviously there were some areas that I worked on more than others. But they were all made incrementally. All those black and white color paintings were done in blocks. You can't tell because I mushed them together and you couldn't tell, but I really was building them incrementally in building blocks. At this point, I said, I thought the thing that made post-war American painting different from European painting was a sense of all-overness, whether it's Jackson Pollock's skein-like ribbons of paint, Frank Stella's black stripes marching across with no difference from one side to the other. And so I wanted to use that sense of all-overness with a representational image. So I decided to spray.
Which nobody else was doing at the time.
No, nobody else was crazy enough. I decided to spray simple, inarticulate dots into a grid, and the fewest number of dots to make a recognizable image of a particular person, not just a head, is about 140, 160 dots. So this is an image about the size of a postage stamp with maybe 140 dots. This is 4 times as many the size of a postcard, 4 times as many the size of a sheet of typing paper, when we used to use typing paper. That's about 16 by 20. And then next is a painting that is, it's actually a drawing, although the modern didn't want to pay that much money for a drawing, they call it a painting. And it's 9 foot high, it has 104,000 dots. Each one sprayed an average of 10 times, so it's 1,400,000 dots until I got arthritis in my trigger finger. And next we'll show, you can see that there is no mark that's more like hair, more like skin, more like glass. It's just clusters of dots that make a mustache, or strings of them make a glass. And I think the next shows me working on it. I used to be skinny. So now this is another color painting. This is my friend Mark Greenwald, a really wonderful painter. I've painted a bunch of times, the goofiest image I've ever done.
Even he described it. Actually, it's right again, right up there on one of the labels in the show. He describes himself, I think, as sweet and goofy.
Yeah, there's a working.
I don't know where the sweet part comes from.
Actually, not a working piece, a piece made afterwards. This painting's in the Met. If you're in the Met, it's on loan there. Here I'm working on it. You can see the dye transfer color separations that I'm working on. You can see that I always had the TV on. It's a black and white self-portrait watercolor.
That's an interesting image of you, though. What year is this?
Oh, I have no idea. You're the.
Yeah, I know. I'm the biographer. I'm supposed to know, but that's.
You're asking me?
It's
70.
But this is an image that you stayed with for a long time.
Yeah, I recycle images. Poor Phil Glass. I've recycled him from same 1968 photograph. I'm still using it today. I feel like I ought to retire his image, the photograph, and haul it up into the rafters of my studio. The way they retire a basketball jersey or something.
Or you could do a tapestry and retire.
Yeah, I did one of those
yeah,
too. Yeah.
I don't know. They ought to do it at Yankee Stadium Field.
This is interesting because a lot of my work, and you'll see in the show that John put together, there's lots of different things that I do. Some of them were done with pulp paper. And pulp paper is just beaten up cloth rags, and you add pigment to it. And I was doing the fill, when you'll see a fill glass that's done with grid, and a grid with squares, that was done by squirting tinted pulp into the squares of one of those plastic waffle grills that go over fluorescent lights in an elevator. In the process of, here's what happens when you're an artist, or at least with me. Individual work then becomes, unique work then becomes multiples or prints. In this case, I was making those pulp paper pieces of fill, and I would drop pulp on the floor. It would harden into little miniature Pringle-sized chips of pulp, which were of the various 24 different grays, 24 warm grays, 24 cool grays, that I used to make the fill. So I started collecting them, and I thought, I'll make a collage out of that. So I glued them onto a canvas, and I made a collage. From that, I then made an irregular shaped grill. I don't think we have that in these slides, do we?
I don't think so.
Okay, here's another.
This
is right
here, yeah.
Yeah. It's nice to see it hang next to one of my late paintings, to see how the incremental units have changed, how my attitude towards them changed. But I was looking for a way to make a piece in which the units were not regular, not in a row like a grid. So I took these puddles of pigment, which were frozen, pulp which are frozen, and I used them as individual increments. Another thing I did was to use my actual body. Oh, we have to go through. Here are the trays of pulp chips on the right, from white to black, tuned like a piano, and glued on to make these.
The ones in the middle are salt and vinegar.
The other thing I decided, any kind of incremental unit was fair game. I decided to ink up my fingers, my thumb and my forefinger, and use those as the incremental unit.
Because you were doing these pretty much simultaneously.
Yeah, really simultaneously, yeah. So, well, I never do two paintings at once, but
No,
mixed,
but there's a total overlap between the pulp paper and the fingerprints.
When I did my retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, Rob Storrs, the curator, said that these paintings were skin making skin. And I thought, well, I thought I was making something that couldn't be forged. But, rim shot. But also he said it was as if I were caressing the face of the subject at the same time as I was painting her. And that was really, I mean, that really resonated with me and was very important to me, because I would like to say I talk a lot about process, technique, how I do stuff, but clearly these are images that are very, very important to me and people who matter to me. I think that's self-evident. A face is a roadmap of the experience, the life the person has had. And in her case, she's a Holocaust survivor. Her entire family, 9, 10 brothers and sisters, were wiped out, her mother, father, everyone else. And yet, by an accident, she survived. And she remained, while with survivor guilt and tremendous pain and loss in her life, she remained one of the most optimistic people that I've ever known in my life.
I had the good fortune to know her,
and I think her face embodies both of those characteristics, the pain and loss and the optimism. But I do think it was like caressing her face while I was making it.
I just, somebody wrote a book a few years ago about asking art historians whether they ever cried in front of paintings. Most of them said no. And I just remember going to the National Gallery one day a few years ago and just walking into the gallery and seeing that painting of Fanny and just bursting into tears. It's, I mean, I knew her, but it was the painting. I mean,
I think if you haven't wept in front of a work of art, you really don't know a work of art.
Right. Most of the art historians seem to be thinking that you should be reacting to the subject matter.
Yeah.
That if there was something sad or tragic about the subject matter, it's not about that at all. It's about the painting and the way it's painted.
Yeah. Well, Vermeer is my favorite painter of all time. And when I go, to the National Gallery and you see the incredible portrait of the woman with the red hat, it's like 6 by 9 inches, packed into that unbelievable small package. The compressed energy, the parted lips. I have to tell you, the greatest orifice in the history of art, her parted lips in that painting. I mean, it's as moving as anything that I could imagine looking at.
That's my favorite from you.
Mm-hmm. This is a fingerprint painting of my wife, also done with just red, blue, and yellow fingerprints, done the same way as the...
but emotionally very different from the painting of Fanny.
Yeah. Here you can see part of the painting is only in its purple state. At a certain point, I decided to go back to using brushes and oil paint. Why? Do you have any idea why?
Well, you said it was because you enjoyed it.
Oh. I did miss the smell of oil paint.
No, what you've told me is that the pastels that you did led you into using oil paint.
That's right, and a print that I did in Japan also, which was, made me want to use brushes. I hadn't used brushes since I started doing the black and white paintings. So this is a painting of Lucas Amaris, and it hangs opposite that painting of Mark and the Met. And Lucas, anybody who knows Lucas, and certainly Francis knows Lucas, Lucas is, if he could run for the job of Ayatollah, he would, and or Svengali or anything like that. So after I did this one, I did another version of him, ta-da, which was a sort of spin art version, a circular grid, and I had everything emanate from where his third eye would be. As if those, if you're anybody old enough, remember the old black and white horror movies, the brain waves coming out of the.
It's a centrifugal painting.
Yes,
yeah,
right.
it's just flying apart.
Yeah. Now here's a painting of Cindy Sherman. Now, no one knows what Cindy Sherman looks like. I didn't recognize her when she showed up. She had her hair pulled back and this school marm, you know, the kind of thing where...
Had you met Cindy before?
Oh yeah, I knew her very well, but I didn't recognize her when she walked in. You remember those movies like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall where the librarian pops her and it all falls down and she's an entire, takes her glasses off, she's a different person. She did it the other way around. She put on glasses and put her hair in a school marm thing. But I photographed her and there was no one there. There wasn't an image. And I had to give her a role. I did 2 paintings of her. I did this one, and I said, I had her move around in the camera, and I said, oh, look like a Brancusi. Now, if you know the Brancusis, where the head is on a long neck, and she immediately took that pose. I did another one of her, which is a profile, and I said, you're going to be you're a queen on a coin or a stamp. And she took this aristocratic, noble thing. She could only play a role. She couldn't be photographed as herself, which I thought was really interesting. Now you go for a while.
Well, one of the
How we doing for
the
time?
exhibition that these photographs we've just seen were from a show that Chuck had in 1988, which he wanted to do portraits of other artists, but specifically of artists who are known for representing themselves. So Alex Katz, Lucas Samaras, Francesco Clementi, Cindy Sherman. He only did one painting in time for the show of Alex Katz. And about 3-4 weeks after the show closed, December 1988, what Chuck chooses to call the event happened, and the event is the reason he's now here in the wheelchair. And if you want to know the story of the recovery, read the book. But this was the first painting that Chuck did, having retaught himself to paint. There's no other way to put it. And to me, Chuck, I think you've never been quite like this painting, right? Hmm? You never quite liked this painting.
Well, you know, it's a tough painting for me to look at.
Yeah.
My wife fought very hard for me to get into rehabilitation and be able to work again. I rolled down the hallway of a rehabilitation hospital, and I saw occupational therapy. I thought, oh, great, they'll get me back to my occupation. But what they wanted to do was to teach me to do my laundry. So I said, wait a minute, I didn't do my laundry before I went to the hospital.
Not true, actually.
Not true, I actually did, but you know, I'd set it for effect. Helped me get back to my real occupation, helped me get back to painting. And I remember that my wife came and we got the first crude brace that would hold a brush.
And this was, by the way, in the most depressing room you could ever be in your life, with the evidence of the occupational therapy that other people, paper chains and little bits of raffia weaving and things.
Oh, there were half-finished baskets.
Facing onto a courtyard that was full of
half-finished baskets
garbage.
because the person died before the basket was done. They gave never mind. But at any rate, so I remember I drew a crude grid on a piece of short cardboard in a vise, and I was going to try and put a glob of paint into each grid. And Chris remembers, first I couldn't sit up. I had to lie down, and they put me on a tilt table like Frankenstein. And every day or every week I would be tilted a little more.
That was always good for a laugh.
It was, yes. Because you were like strapped to this table.
If he came up too abruptly, his blood pressure
I'd pass out, so I couldn't sit up to paint. Finally, I could sit up enough to try and paint. So I had a brush, I'd load it up with some paint, and I'd sort of fall on the thing and hope that I hit the right square. And I immediately break into tears, and I'm bellowing, "You see, I can't do it." I'm milking it for all the sympathy I can get. And I'm thinking, well, it's not that bad. I had my assistant would come, and I would tell him to mix the paint. Some cadmium yellow light, a little more white, a little phthalo green, a little bit more, not so much. And then he would load the brush, and he would put it in my brush holder, and then I would fall on the painting. And he reminds me that I cried every day. I have no memory of that whatsoever. To me, it was a celebratory, positive experience. In fact, this painting to me embodies both, because the photograph that I worked from wasn't nearly as sad looking. This is like a sad clown. In fact, it's a little scary image of Alex. But you can't tell from this slide. It's riotous color, much brighter than I had used before, and very celebratory.
Well, interestingly too, there's a print that's taken from the same image, right, that's in the show, and that print is actually almost drained of color. It's almost like a black and white print.
I did a black and white version. It was drained of color.
Okay. Hooray for Hollywood.
Okay, this is a black and white painting. I do a lot of black and white works. When I work in black, this is full of warm and cool blacks. When I do black and white work, the world becomes black and white. That's all I see when I look outside. The first time I go to make a color painting, and I squeeze the paint on the canvas on the palette for the first time, it's like, wow, I've never seen color before. And then I go out in the world, and there's a yellow cab against a green wall with a blue door and an orange sign. So I kind of go ripping back and forth.
How important is it to you that you only ever work on one painting at a time?
Totally important. Totally. I can only do one thing at a time. I would never finish them. I hardly finish them as they are. But I would never get anything done. But to stay there till it's done.
But is that to do with something like you're just saying, the fact that you're seeing the world in black and white?
I tried, when I had a house in the country, I tried to work on one painting in the country and one in the city. And then when I'd go to the country and I'd sit there for 2 days trying to figure out what I'm doing and paint for a day, and then I'd move back to the city and I'd sit there for 2 days figuring out what I was doing. So I decided to just do one at a time.
Good idea.
Oh, this is Roy Lichtenstein. I think this painting is in the Hirshhorn, if you guys travel up to DC. This is part of my Old Men with Ponytails series. This is here to explain the difference between the horizontal vertical grid and the diagonal grid. If you can imagine Roy with a diagonal grid, his nose would be like a ski jump. It would just be a straight line right off the canvas. So I decided to do him with a horizontal vertical grid. So is there a detail of that? I can't remember. Yeah. So that your eye splashes down the shapes like water over rocks on a waterfall. That then gave me the opportunity to do this Dick Tracy jaw which I thought for a guy who's made a career out of painting cartoons was apropos. Next. Usually I do diagonal, or often I do diagonal grids. This is a self-portrait done on the diagonal. I may be stupid, but I'm not crazy, so I don't paint uphill. I turn the painting on its corner so I can paint straight across. Below the tape is the first pass, which is...
Yeah, maybe you could tell us something about that, because that's something that I think people don't realize. You're not sort of working very slowly, logically. You actually start off with quite random color underneath.
Right. I like the idea of building a painting rather than painting it. So it's done in layers. The first layer is rather capriciously and arbitrarily arrived at color that is decidedly not skin-like, not skin
It
color.
almost looks like a sort of some crazy Fauves thing, yeah.
Yeah, Fauves quilt.
Right.
And then the 4 or 5 correcting colors that go on top, we'll have to move it from something wrong to something right. And I try to do that in a series of correcting colors and shapes.
We're not doing the golf thing today?
I don't think we have time for golf, do we?
No, that's true.
How much?
It's too bad the Ryder Cup is on at the
Oh, it
moment.
is.
It would have
It's
been
true.
appropriate.
I could do an abridged version. Okay. Anybody out there admit to playing golf? Raise your hand. Oh, come on. Golf, if you mix paint on a palette and you then put that paint directly into the painting, that's equivalent of shooting an arrow straight at a bullseye. You hope that you hit it. I thought that the way I work was much more like golf. Golf is the only sport that in which you move from general to specific in an ideal number of correcting moves.
Just the opposite of the way you dress for golf.
Well, I always said that God invented golf so that white people would have a reason to dress funky. When you're at the tee, can we do, we're in the South, can I say things like that? I don't know. When you're at the tee, you can't even see the green. It's a dog leg to the right. You don't even know where you're going. So the first stroke is just out there, a leap of faith. The second stroke corrects that. Third, that by third or fourth stroke, hopefully you're on the green, and that you couldn't even see from the tee. And hopefully you can putt out in 1 or 2 strokes. Not Tiger Woods anymore, but he used to be able to. And you place that ball in a very specific 3.5-inch diameter circle, which you found moving through the landscape, making mid-course corrections. So that is how I make these paintings. Each time I add a color, I'm moving closer to what I want. I just tee off in the wrong direction so that the corrections have to be more extreme.
I figured out that one of these paintings is equivalent to 630 rounds of golf.
And I'm dragging my own clubs. Okay. And there's the, back up just the one to the other one for a second. You can see that there are not skin colors. A lot of people ask me if my work has anything to do with pointillism. And I hate to tell you, but they lied to you in art history about pointillism. If you look at Seurat, he really didn't mix the color optically the way it's been suggested. Most of the dots are the generic color of whatever it is he's painted. So most of the grass dots are green, most of the sky dots are blue, etc. And other dots are thrown in to sort of alter it. And I tried to do it with very unlikely, very colors which are not skin-like at all. I went, while I was living in Rome a number of years ago, I took a pilgrimage to Ravenna to look at the Byzantine mosaics. I thought I should check them out, and I hated them. I just hated them, which is one of the great things about being an artist, it's not art appreciation. You don't have to love everything. You just love the stuff that's useful. Anyhow, I hated these things up there. I know it's blasphemy, whatever, the art historians, but they're dark. You can't see the individual tesserae. They're glistening, they're glass, they're gold, they're whatever. And when I went over instead to Padua to see my favorite Giotto frescoes to cleanse the palate from these things. And I beat my way back down to Rome, and I went to the Villa Borghese, which has some wonderful, humble Roman floor mosaics embedded in the floor. And I realized why I like the Roman floor mosaics and not the Byzantine mosaics. Because your viewing distance is your height. You are looking down on the floor. You're standing on the floor, or in this case, I'm sitting on the floor. But you look down on the floor, the insistent flatness of the floor is there. Flat, 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 stone, stone, stone on a flat surface. Just as you're looking at the floor, looking at the flat surface, looking at the stones, all of a sudden it warps into a line, and you go, ooh, wow. Look what this guy did centuries ago. He managed to put these stones down in such a way that it can become a lion. And then when you really want to see the lion, it flattens back out and becomes a floor again with stones. And I realized that looking at these mosaics was a contemporary experience for me, as if I were looking over the shoulder of the artisan as he made these decisions. It's a record of the decisions that he made. Chipping the corner, and it had to be a he, they didn't let women do that sort of thing then. Chipping the corner off this stone, nudging it in, a cluster of 4 or 5 or 6 stones would become a paw or an ear and a lion or whatever it was. And I realized that across the centuries, I was doing essentially the same thing, which is ripping back and forth between the flat reading and the images it made. Now, I always railed against the idea of being called a new realist or a photorealist or any kind of realist, because I was always as interested in the artificial as I was in the real. And I want people to look at the district. It's colored dirt, smeared on some cloth. You take a stick with hairs glued on the end of it, and you rub it around in colored dirt, and you smear it on some canvas, wrapped around some wooden sticks. It makes space where there is no sticks. It's highly artificial.
So you're giving away the conjuring trick again.
What?
You're giving away the magic trick again.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's true. It's true. It's really true. Absolutely true.
Which seems to be that we're rounding up with that.
I'm pulling back the curtain on the magic trick, too. Do you want to talk for 5 more minutes? Or?
Okay.
Okay, good.
Real quick. Or we could go to questions. We'll do it real quick.
I don't think we're set up for questions
Not
tonight.
set up for questions.
No, sorry.
Ooh. This painting of Lyle Ashton Harris, the photographer. There are all kinds of stuff in there that's I won't go on. You can see Northwest Indian mask, all kinds of stuff that show up in there. Next. Hard to paint a baby. They haven't had a life. Really, there's no wrinkles. There's none of that stuff that I love to paint. Next. There's a life. My 75-year-old, at the time, he's now older, I think, lawyer, a real punum, if you know what I mean. Next. Linda Biglis, best known for perhaps a double-ended dildo at the other end of her life.
Good painting.
Huh?
Good painting.
Great painter. She's a great painter, great artist. She's a great.
Linda and Chuck were the first time Chuck showed in New York. You showed with Linda.
I had a painting on the wall, and she had a poured rubber piece on the floor. And now.
And who's this?
Fearless leader. When I painted
the
him.
economy is stupid.
When I painted him, I said, you know, and I knew the National Gallery owns the painting. It's on loan to the National Portrait Gallery. And so I said to him, you know, you're going to be in the National Gallery, and there isn't a painting of a president in the National Gallery since Gilbert Stuart painted the Founding Fathers. I said, but you're going to be much more excited because you're going to hang next to Andy Warhol's Elvis. When I tried to paint him, his mouth looked like a bunch of chiclets. So I had to find a way to recombine the teeth into a kind of shmoo-like shape. He was only upset about the bags under his eyes. All right, I think that's it.
That's it.